Hello, in this video I'm going to give another demo on how to work with arrays. I'm going to create a program that generates 100, maybe 1,000 random numbers and then computes their average and prints it out. So let's make an array of integers. So to make one integer, I would say int value. That creates one integer called value. I don't want one integer, I want an array of integers. I want a block of integers. I don't want one integer, I want an integer array. So the square brackets denotes an array. I want an integer array, and we'll call it values because there's more than one thing in it. And I need to carve out that space using the word new integer array of, I don't know, we'll give it 100 elements there. So this is the syntax for allocating an array that doesn't have any default values. If you just Google C# arrays, you'll see all the Microsoft documentation come up. There's no real way to know this other than just to kind of memorize it. But just keep in mind, what I've done now is I've created an integer array with 100 slots. And now let me go initialize each one of those slots to a random number. And if I'm going to be making random numbers, I need a random number generator. And the C# class for that is called random. And I'll make a random number generator called R. And that equals new random. There we go. So now I've created a new random number generator. All right, so now let's go initialize the values in our array. So now I could do something like values square brackets 0 equals r dot next. Let's say 0 to 100. So I'm putting numbers between 0 and 100 into each cell. And but now, Nick, hopefully already the fire alarm in your brain is going off saying, oh my god, there's 100 of these things, really? You're going to do this 100 times? Yeah, anytime you have something like this that you're just repeating over and over again, this is the perfect place to use a loop. So let's use a for loop to initialize our array, every cell in our array, to a random number. So let's create a for loop. So to make a for loop, I just type for tab tab. For loops are generally used when you know how many times you want to loop. How many times do you want to repeat an operation? And we want to repeat our operation 100 times because that's how many times, or that's how many slots we have in our array. And here's our code to generate random numbers. And let's think about what this does. This is going to repeat 100 times, and every time it's going to set the first item in the array to a random number. That's not really what we want. On the first loop through the array, we want to set the thing in slot 0 to a random number. Then we want to loop again and set the thing in slot 1 to a random number, and slot 2 to a random number, and slot 3 to a random number, and slot 4 to a random number. And we can do that by just taking our loop counter and using that as our index. So the first time this loop iterates, it will say, okay, I is 0, set value sub 0 equal to a random number. Then we add 1 to the loop counter, test our loop condition, and come around again. So I will be 1 the second time we go through this loop counter. So now we're going to generate a random number and stick it in values sub 1, and value sub 2, value sub 3. We go around and around and around until I is equal to 100, at which point the looping condition is no longer true, and program execution will jump past the loop. We're done. We're done with the loop anymore. We don't need to loop. So having said that, let me just review for loops again. This is the part where we initialize our loop counter variable. This is keep tracks of how many times we've been through the loop. This is the loop condition. As long as this condition is true, we will repeat the body of the loop. And there's the body of the loop. That's the third part of a for loop. That's what we're repeating. And then after we've executed the body of the loop, we update the loop counter. In this case, we're adding 1 to it. We're saying I++, add 1 to I. So I starts off as 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way up to 100. When I is 100, this condition is false, and we stop looping. So let's just run this and see what it does. I'm going to hit F9 to put in a breakpoint, and run this, and we'll see what happens. So let's look at values here. You can see that every slot in values has now been set to a random number. And if I scroll down all the way to the bottom, you should see there's 99. 99 is my highest index. I have 100 slots going from 0 to 99 because indexes start at 0. Let's run that again and actually step through the for loop in the debugger. And so there we go. Notice the first thing we do is set I to 0. Then we test if the loop condition is true. And now the loop condition is true, so we're going to execute the body of the loop, and you can see I is 0. So generate a random number, stick it in slot 0. Now we update the loop counter. I is now 1. Is 1 less than 100? Yes. So we enter the body of the loop. I is now 1. So we're going to generate a random number and stick it in slot 1. So you can see all the cells start off as 0. That's their default value. But now we're going around sticking random numbers in an index that is increasing by 1 every time we step through the loop. There we go. I is now 2, right? So if I hover over my array and I look at it with the debugger, you can see that index 2 has now been set to a random number, right? And I just go around and around and around 100 times. Okay. So now how do we compute the average? Well, actually, let's write to the console here and just dump out our array console.writeLine array values square brackets plus I plus equals. So anything in quotation marks is just text that's going to get printed out, and then the value of I will get stuffed in there. And let's write out whatever is in that slot, whatever is in index. So you'll see what this does here when I run it. It's going to print out, the first time through it'll say the value sub 0 equals whatever that value is. Value sub 1 equals whatever that value is. Value sub 2 equals whatever that value is. It's just going to print out the array to the console. There you can see it dumped out all our random numbers. Okay, now let's add them all up. To take the average, we need to add up all of the numbers and then divide by the number of elements. Let me make an integer called sum, and I'm going to set it to 0. And every time we go through the loop, I'm going to add the current random number to the sum. So I'll say sum equals sum plus values square brackets, or values sub, values at I. So add the thing in slot I to the sum, and then assign that back to sum. So sum equals sum plus values. Take whatever sum was, add values to it, and assign that new quantity back to sum. This is the relative box in GameMaker. Just take the thing, take its whatever the value is, add something to it. There's a shorthand notation for that. Plus equals means add this to that. It's a shorthand way of writing it. But you can write it out longhand or shorthand, it's up to you. So by the time we get to the end of this loop, we should be able to print out our sum. Sum equals plus sum. So it's going to write out the word sum equals, and then it's going to tack on the value of that variable. So let's see what we got here. If I pop up my console window, scroll down to the bottom, where'd it go? Sum equals 5420. That's the sum of the of all of the values in the array. And now I'll just print out the average by dividing that number by 100. Average equals sum divided by 100. Now this is going to be interesting. Let's watch what happens and then see if we can fix it. If you're thinking that there's going to be a decimal point in your answer, you're wrong, because sum is an integer and we're dividing it by an integer. And when you divide integers, you divide numbers exactly like you did in first or second grade. Like 2 would go into 5 twice with a remainder, right? So there's no decimal point. We're not getting into tenths, 100ths, or thousandths, right? To actually do that, we have to be sneaky. We can put .0 on the end of our 100. So this says divide this integer by this double precision number, and then in order to do that calculation, the code will kind of be generated to convert this thing to a double precision number, and then divide it by a double precision number. So that's just kind of a little trick that you can use if you need to convert something to a double precision number. And now if I divide this, or run this thing, sorry, not divide it, you can see now we get our decimal point. So that was what we had to do there, was make sure that this was a floating point number, or a number with a decimal point, so that when we performed the division, the result would be a double precision number, which is a number with a decimal point. So there you go. Hopefully that kind of is another illustration of how arrays work. We're just looping over our array, setting each cell to a random number. We could, if you're maybe we could have set them all to 50 or 100, or we could have set them to the loop counter. Let's just do that real fast. Watch this. I'm gonna set the value in every cell to the loop counter. Let's just watch what happens. And let's watch what happens. There we go. So let's pop over here, and you can see the first time we're just sticking the loop counter in the array. So we've generated the numbers between 0 and 99. That's how the visual sort program generates its data, the numbers between 1 and 100. It just uses a loop counter and sticks the loop counter in the array. So there you go. More examples of working with arrays. But if you have questions on working with arrays, by all means ask for help. We'll be happy to provide it.